Aidan Doxey. This is my archival research presentation for CCS 325, the Automobile and Society. So my first entry was called Perils of the Country Road in Harper's Weekly from 1910, and it talked about how the automobile was making more remote rural areas open for tourism that hadn't been open before. And it really talked about how there was a conflict between people who were using cars to tour the area and people who lived there because the roads and infrastructure weren't ready to support something as powerful as a car. And I thought it was interesting how the country dwellers could serve as an example of Carlo Placci's idea of hostile tribes who formed a dislike of the automobile without using it themselves. My second entry was How Fool Driving Affects the Popularity of the Automobile from the Outing magazine. And this was examining how, when the automobile was first introduced, the reckless driving of some drivers was almost ruining the public image of all drivers. And I thought that was really interesting because it kind of honed in on how driving the car was a more individual experience than any type of transportation that had come before it. Because, like, when a boat sinks or a train crashes, there's always a bunch of other factors that people look at besides the individual, but in this case, it was just drivers are bad because of the decisions they make. And I thought that was very interesting. My third entry was called One Man's Tour into Canada, and it was an American motorist from 1910, and it told a story of a group of people who drove from New York City into some of the outer territories of Canada. And I thought this article really illustrated how price was very prohibitive in the early days of the automobile, not just in buying it, but for going on a long distance trip. The author, Burnham, kept a huge list of all the parts that he needed to keep the car going, and that was very expensive. So even if you could buy a car, you couldn't necessarily take it fast distances. And another thing I found interesting about this article was the reactions that the local people in Canada showed. He talks about how some people threatened to shoot him, and other people came up to the car, were very interested, and asked for rides. And I thought these polarized reactions that he talked about were good examples of Placci's idea of hostile tribes. Fourth entry was called Taxicabs in the Provinces from the Automotor Journal. And it talked about how there was a conflict in some towns in England between the traditional horse carriage drivers and the new motorized taxicab drivers who were moving in and taking their business. And this article really reminded me of kind of some of the social Darwinist aspects of new technology that we talked about in the class. And the language in the article was really clear about how people who adopted the new technology of the motor cab were going to adapt to the new technological age and survive, while the horse carriage drivers would become obsolete and they would go out of business. So my fifth entry was called The Domestication of the Automobile, a Financial and Architectural Movement from Harper's Weekly. And this was a really unique article because, like the other ones I analyzed, it admits that the automobile was exciting and speeding up society, but it also criticized it a lot. And in particular, this article talked about how the storage space a car required in a house was leading to what the author thought was some really ugly architecture. But it wasn't all negative, and the author compared the situation with the car to the situation of architects in the Renaissance having to adapt to storing the horse-drawn carriages. And it kind of characterized the automobile as just another in a long line of technologies that people would have to adapt to and get used to over time. My sixth entry was called The Goddess in the Car from Car Illustrated in 1903. And it was about how the car was a convenient choice for celebrities who wanted to travel without being seen. And I thought it showed how differences between car owners and non-car owners appeared almost immediately after the automobile was introduced, because while regular people still had to rely on public transportation, people who own cars had a more private method of traveling. And I thought this difference could really contribute to people self-sorting into different tribes that would support or be against the automobile as a new technology. Entry was called Impressions by the Way from Munsey's magazine in 1903. And this article touched on the idea of tech evangelism when it discussed how critics of the automobile could be converted into advocates of the automobile, and the best way they thought you could do this was by letting people experience driving or taking a ride in a car themselves, because the immediate physiological experience of being in the car is a lot more powerful than just hearing logical arguments about how great the car was. And my eighth entry was also from Munsey's magazine, and it was an article called Automobiles and Good Roads. And this also talked about tech evangelism, and in this case, it was talking about car clubs who were trying to convert politicians who thought that the car was just a toy for rich people into supporting improvements for infrastructure that would benefit everyone once the car became more affordable. Ninth entry was called Recognition of the Educated Value of Automobilism, and it was from the The Motorist's Pictorial in 1905. And it was about how the automobile had educational value for everyone, even if you didn't own one yourself. And to give an example of this, the article talked about an auto show that was free for engineering students. And I thought this article highlighted how the automobile helped usher in kind of an anthropological shift in society as certain groups of people became interested in engineering and technology because of their enthusiasm for the automobile. My last entry was called High-Speed Cars and the Proposal of Numbering in England from the Horseless Age in 1902. And it was another article that talked about how groups of reckless drivers could ruin the reputation of drivers themselves as an overall group. And what was specific about this article was the time it was written was when the car was first being introduced and it was relatively expensive. So the combination of only very wealthy people being able to drive it and reckless behavior could really create these hostile tribes that Carlo Blacci talked about very easily. And I thought it was interesting how the form of tech evangelism the car clubs in this article undertook was not trying to get people to adopt the car themselves, but to regulate the car to improve people's opinions of it so they wouldn't be against it, and then they could all enjoy it when it became less expensive. And that's it for my presentation.